Let's go Broncos! Something is happening inside the Denver Broncos wide receiver room that could completely change the way this offense looks this season. And the craziest part is that the biggest story may not even be the names everyone is already talking about. There's a possibility that while defenses focus on the obvious stars, another player quietly emerges and becomes the weapon nobody sees coming. And when you start connecting all the pieces, the depth, the different skill sets, the growing roles, and the expectations surrounding this group, one question starts getting louder. Are Broncos fans about to witness the most dangerous receiver room this team has had in years? Stay with me because the details behind this are much bigger than people realize. But before we continue, make sure you've already hit the like button if you truly believe the Denver Broncos are building something special this season. And if you're feeling optimistic about where this team is heading, drop this in the comments right now. Go Broncos! 2026 is our year to shock everyone. Now let's get directly into this because there are several things happening here that deserve a closer look. Everything begins with the arrival of Jaylen Waddle, because according to the information in the material, his impact is not being viewed only as another receiver joining the room. The discussion goes far beyond individual production. The expectation being described is that his presence affects the entire offense around him. The running game is expected to benefit. The overall balance of the offense is expected to improve. Defensive backs during practices are expected to be challenged in ways they weren't before. There is a belief that his addition elevates everyone around him rather than functioning as an isolated move. And when you start looking at the names already in the room, things become even more interesting. Courtland Sutton, Pat Bryant, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, and now Jaylen Waddle joining that group. The conversation suddenly shifts from do the Broncos have enough talent to something completely different. Now the question becomes, how do you distribute opportunities? Because there is only one football. That is where things begin getting really fascinating. The material repeatedly highlights how talented these players are individually, but now the challenge becomes fitting all of the pieces together collectively. And that's where Denver may actually have a unique situation developing. Courtland Sutton continues being described as someone who can create major problems in one-on-one situations and consistently delivered in key moments. Third downs, deeper routes, critical situations, his impact continued showing up. But now imagine something else happening. If Jaylen Waddle attracts defensive attention, if Courtland Sutton draws extra coverage, who benefits? That is where the younger players become incredibly important. Troy Franklin's development was specifically pointed out as something that could easily become overlooked because of the excitement surrounding the new addition. Yet his progression reportedly showed up in several ways. His target numbers increased significantly, his catch efficiency improved, and his drop percentage decreased. Even more interesting, there were examples mentioned where heavier involvement appeared to correlate with stronger offensive performances. Then there is Marvin Mims, and there is almost a mystery surrounding him in this discussion. Because according to the information, whenever Marvin Mims is operating at his best, he looks explosive with the football in his hands and creates game-changing moments. There is speed. There is creativity. There are return abilities that add another layer to his value. Yet there remains curiosity about how much larger his offensive involvement could become. And then Pat Bryant enters the conversation. The material suggests there may still be untapped potential there. His route work, his hands, his ability to settle into coverage and find opportunities were all highlighted as areas where more could still emerge. But here's where the story becomes really interesting for Broncos fans. This may not become a season where one receiver completely dominates every week. The discussion introduces an idea that could define the entire season, the best supporting actor. Not one constant star every single game. Different players stepping forward depending on matchups. One week perhaps one player becomes the major factor. Next week someone else creates the big moments. Another week someone else moves the chains. That possibility alone changes how defenses may need to approach Denver. Because if defensive attention begins concentrating on Sutton and Waddle, opportunities naturally begin opening elsewhere. And that may be where the real story starts unfolding. The biggest question now isn't whether talent exists. The biggest question is who becomes that unexpected difference maker when defenses focus somewhere else. And this is where the entire conversation starts becoming even more intriguing because when we continue looking deeper into the information surrounding this wide receiver room, the focus shifts away from simply asking who the stars are and starts asking a completely different question. How exactly does Denver maximize all of these weapons at the same time? Because one thing that stood out was the repeated idea that there are already two expected constants in this offense. The expectation is that Courtland Sutton will get his opportunities, and Jaylen Waddle will get his opportunities. Those names continue appearing as the primary focal points. But football never works in a perfectly predictable way every week. Defenses adjust, matchups change, coverages shift, and that may be where Denver suddenly becomes extremely difficult to defend. Think about the possibilities being discussed. If defensive attention starts collapsing toward Sutton on one side, if additional help begins rotating toward Jalen Watt, suddenly somebody else enters favorable situations. Now Troy Franklin may see lighter coverage. Now Marvin Mims may face a different matchup. Now Pat Bryant may become the player taking advantage of soft areas in coverage. And according to the material, that flexibility may become one of the biggest strengths this entire group possesses. There was even discussion about how different players can be used based entirely on opponent tendencies. Maybe 1 week speed becomes the priority. Maybe another week size becomes the priority. Maybe another week route running becomes the deciding factor. Maybe another week a specific player matches up better against a certain defensive back. That creates a situation where Denver does not necessarily need to force the exact same formula every single game. And then another major point starts appearing. Development. Because one thing repeatedly mentioned is that the players Broncos fans saw previously are not necessarily expected to be identical versions moving forward. There's an expectation that growth could continue taking place because experience within the offense matters. More repetitions matter. More understanding matters. More opportunities matter. And that creates another layer of intrigue. Because if Troy Franklin continues progressing, if Marvin Mims becomes more involved, if Pat Bryant unlocks more of his skill set, then suddenly the discussion about talent starts becoming very difficult to ignore. Then we move into the depth conversation, and this is another area where things become interesting. The material points toward the belief that the top names in the room are likely established, but there are also players viewed as important depth pieces and possible practice squad contributors. Lil Jordan Humphrey and Michael Bandy were discussed as players who have provided valuable depth and familiarity within the system. Then another name appeared that deserves attention. Michael Woods too. According to the information provided, he earned attention after joining through a tryout situation, and there was specific mention of chain-moving catches and strong effort as a blocker. Then additional names entered the picture among undrafted players being monitored, including DNEK, Joseph Manjack, Cameron Ross, and Kabi Katsus, with special attention being given to return abilities and developmental upside. So now take a step back and look at the entire picture. You have established contributors. You have developing young players. You have depth. You have players with different skill sets. You have players with speed. You have players with size. You have players who can create after the catch. You have players capable of creating different matchup situations. That is why the conversation in the material repeatedly returned to one central idea. This room may simply have more overall talent than Broncos fans have seen in a very long time. Now Broncos fans, if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and check out the next video on the screen because we're going to keep following every development surrounding this team. And now I want to hear from you in the comments. If you had to predict it right now, which receiver outside of Sutton and Jalen Watt becomes the biggest surprise of the season?